Okay, so I've been thinking about this week what I should do. And I don't think it's okay for the Christian church to just have 1 week that talks about Easter. Easter is so important. I think that it might be a good idea for us to continue studying what happened at Easter. So again, I want to share a story that we see in the Bible about Easter. So last week, we talked a little bit about it, but tonight, we're going to discuss 2 people. The first one I want to discuss is a man whom a lot of people thought about in a bad way. And I think that maybe he wasn't as bad as we believe, but I'll explain. So I wanted to talk about Doubting Thomas. Now, why do we call him Doubting Thomas? Who knows? I don't think everyone can see you. Oh, okay. No, Andy can't see you. When Jesus appeared to his disciples, Thomas said, "Is that really you? Show me proof. Show me the scars in your hands. I want to see them for myself." He didn't believe right away. Yes, so we see that on the day that Jesus rose from the grave, he appeared to some believers, but a lot of the disciples were not there, or not all of them were there, specifically Thomas. And the disciples said, "Wake up. We saw Jesus rose from the grave. It's amazing what he has done." And Thomas was like, "Whatever, you people are crazy." He didn't believe that Jesus had risen from the grave. And to emphasize the depth of his unbelief, he said, "I will only believe if I can put my fingers in the holes in his hands and his side myself." Now maybe you think, what a stupid guy. But if we're honest, sometimes we're doubtful too, right? And I think that's okay a little bit. Because if we believe everything without question, then we'll never learn. So I think it is okay for us to have doubts, and sometimes not to believe everything, but it's not okay if we stay in that place. We need to grow, analyze our faith, and study the Bible, and ask ourselves why some people believe this and other people believe that. And we need to come to God and tell him what our doubts are and confess them, because God knows anyway. We can't hide them from God. Just like in the story of Jonah, we can't just hop on a boat and run away and hide from God. So it's okay if we have some doubts, but we need to press on and really dig into what our doubts are. Now, Thomas did not start out as a doubter. We see in other stories before Jesus' death, there was one time that Jesus said, "Okay, let's all go to Jerusalem." And the disciples knew that people in Jerusalem, specifically the Pharisees, wanted to kill Jesus. Well, Thomas said, okay, let's go with Jesus, even if it means we die with him. So Thomas didn't start out doubting. He started out strong. But we know what happened the night that Jesus was arrested. What happened to the disciples? They were afraid and they ran away. Right. The disciples became weak and fled. A lot of them spoke like brave men, but when the soldiers showed up, they fled. One ran away naked with no clothes on. Do you know why we know that? Because it's found in the book of John. And we think John was confessing that. Now, lucky for Thomas, this isn't the end of his story. But in the same chapter in the book of John, it reads that a week later, the disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. The doors were closed and locked. And Jesus appeared and said, "Peace be with you." Now, hold on for a second. Why do you think that Jesus needed to say peace? He was kind of telling them to chill because they were freaking out. There was a dead man standing in the middle of the room. Our doors are closed and locked. How did he get here? So Jesus was like, calm down, it's okay. I know that if my dead family member showed up one night, I would be petrified. So Jesus was like, calm down, peace. But it's interesting, Jesus looked directly at Thomas and said, "Put your fingers in my hands and in my side. Stop doubting and believe." Then Thomas said, "My Lord and my God." Immediately, Thomas changed from being doubting Thomas to a believer. He understood that Jesus is Lord and God. Then Jesus said to him, "Because you have seen me, you believe. But blessed are those who have not seen me and yet believe." Okay. That last passage, Jesus is talking to who? The last verse in 29, Jesus is describing who?
We haven't seen Jesus. That was like 2,000 years ago, but we still have faith and we believe.
Yes, perfect. Okay, so let's discuss. What does that story teach us? What does it teach us?
It teaches that Jesus seeks us out and finds us when we are even in our doubts.
Jesus seeks us out and finds us even when we're in our doubts. Yes. Our doubts don't have to keep us from Jesus in the end. Yes?
That God would prefer that we believed him based on what he's already revealed to us.
My mom taught me about God and having a relationship with him. When I feel alone, I don't have to feel guilty or sad. But my mom taught me that, to have a relationship with God and learn to follow him.
Yes. And you don't have to doubt, but have faith. Jen says, I also think that we learn that God was not angry at Thomas. He could have been like, are you kidding me? And just furious, but he wasn't. He spoke with Thomas. He had a discussion with him. I really think that Jesus was kind of funny. He's like, come here, come look at these holes in my hands and my side. Because he knew what Thomas had said. And I think if I had been Thomas and he quoted my own words, my jaw would have dropped. I would have been stunned. Oh, I'm so sorry. So let's discuss news. We've heard about fake news. Who saw this story? It was a really popular story online. It said that an FBI agent who had found Hillary Clinton's fake emails had killed himself. This was online 3 days before the election. And a lot of people were like, look at this. Can you believe this? This is so terrible. And supposedly it happened in a town in Maryland, but there was one problem. Well, two problems really. One is that the man in the story did not exist, and the name of the town did not exist. It was so fake that if you went to the website and tried to click on the other links on that website, nothing happened because all of them were fake. But 10 million people saw that story. 10 million people looked at this and thought, oh my gosh, this could be true. Now, we live in a society with a lot of fake news, right? But is this statement, he is risen, fake news? That Jesus rose from the dead, is that fake? Because for Thomas, he totally thought it was fake. He was thinking, whatever, Jesus isn't alive. But how do we know that he truly is risen? Many people saw him and wrote it down and passed down the stories. Last week we saw that Paul said that 500 people had seen Jesus after he had risen back to life. Why else do we believe the resurrection happened?
What I found was very interesting is that the conviction that they're confident that it's actually true, it remains steady throughout the years. But if they actually doubted it, if they were skeptical, it will rise and fall, it will falter, the good news will falter. So if they didn't truly believe it, they wouldn't be consistent with the good news. steady.
Right. So they remained steady in their belief. If they had doubted, then the story would have faltered, but it kept going. People believed. More thoughts? Jesus' disciples were persecuted and died over what they claimed to have seen. So if it hadn't been true, I'm pretty sure they would have said, just kidding, I made it all up, instead of dying for it. Wait a minute. But his disciples became super rich and popular, right? And they had awesome lives? Negative. No, they did not. They were willing to sacrifice everything. Would they do that for a lie? No.
It's like the saying that I really like. The truth always stands, the lie never does.
Yes. Remember in the story about the disciples, what happened to them the night that Jesus was arrested? They fled, right? They were terrified. But after they saw that Jesus had risen, what happened to the disciples? They became
Very confident.
confident, yes. They said, whatever you do to me is fine. I am willing to die for the gospel, for Jesus. Because I am not a liar who made this up. I actually saw Jesus alive, raised from the dead. And no one at that time in Jerusalem could produce Jesus' body. The people at the temple said, oh yeah, someone stole his body. That's what happened. If they knew that he was dead and in the ground, or in the grave, they could have just rolled the stone away and said, look, here's his body. But they couldn't. And if it was fake, someone would have confessed that it was fake. They would have said, don't kill me, this is a lie. You know the story in our country about Watergate with President Nixon? He cheated in an election, right? And what happened? Shortly after, people who knew about the lies started spreading the news. They ratted him out. He couldn't hide what he had done. And there were only a few people who knew that he had cheated. But the news spread quickly. But not with Jesus. It was clear that he was not lying. And again, if it was fake, why would someone be willing to die for a lie? Last, this is a little weird, but long ago in that culture, in a court, women could not testify about what they saw. People wouldn't believe them. But it's interesting that the first people who saw Jesus after he rose again were women. Now, that's important because if the disciples had made up the story, they never would have used women in the story. Because other people would have been like, whatever, women said that. It doesn't mean anything. But the disciples said that because it really happened. Jesus appeared to women first. Now, let's discuss why Jesus appeared to women first. We're going to look at one more story in the Bible. And the woman's name is Mary Magdalene. Now, a lot of, in the history of the church, her story has changed some. Some people think that she was a prostitute. But that's not in the Bible. We see in Luke chapter 8 that there was a large group of women among the disciples of Jesus, and one of them was Mary Magdalene, whom Jesus had healed from 7 demons. But it does not say that she was a prostitute. But it's a good point that we see that Jesus wasn't only with male disciples. A lot of women were there with him too. Now, do you remember what happened to the disciples the night before Jesus died, before he was arrested? They ran scared, right? But were the women also afraid? No. When Jesus was crucified, who was there with Jesus? His mom, Mary, and another woman named Mary, and Mary Magdalene. 3 Marys. There was one disciple there as well, but all the other men had fled. Now, men, I think that this should convict us some. You might try to think of an excuse for the men back then, like, oh, maybe the women wouldn't have been punished for believing Jesus, but that's not true. A lot of the stories that took place in Romans happened to women too. We know that the women were also punished. Women worked to death in that society. So it wasn't easy. They could have fled with the disciples as well, but they were brave and they stood with Jesus when he hung on the cross. And one of the women was Mary Magdalene. Now, I think that maybe that's why Jesus appeared to women first after he rose from the grave. Do you know why the women were there on Easter morning? Justice says to bring spices to put on his body. Yes, because Jesus had died the day before the Sabbath, their holy day. And you couldn't touch a dead body on the Sabbath. They just stuck him in the tomb and rolled the stone. But the women wanted to honor their friend by anointing his body with oils and spices. They wanted to honor Jesus. Now the men, it was their responsibility, but they were hiding. The women appeared. Now my point is not just that we should honor women, because I think that we should honor women and that Jesus did honor women. But the point is that we men also need to be convicted, because a lot of times we're scared to lead our families. We're scared to proclaim the gospel. We're scared to stand up for what's right and true. In America right now, our society is collapsing. Not because women are weak, but because men are weak. We're not willing to lead. We're not willing to make sacrifices for our families. So many babies are born right now with no fathers. And so many dads refuse to lead and refuse to sacrifice. But God gives us the opportunity to serve as men. So really, it's to the disciples' shame that this happened. But there's also grace. The disciples were shown the truth. Jesus appeared first to women, but the disciples did learn about it. After Mary sees that the stone has been rolled away and the tomb is empty, she's confused a bit, right? So we'll see what happens next. Mary Magdalene stood outside the tomb where Jesus had been buried, crying. Mary knelt down and looked inside the tomb. There she saw 2 angels dressed in white. The angels sat where Jesus' head and feet had been. They asked Mary, "Why are you crying?" Mary answered, "Someone has taken away the body of my Lord, and I don't know where to find Jesus." Then Mary turned and saw Jesus standing before her, but she didn't realize it was Jesus. Jesus asked her, "Why are you crying? Who are you looking for?" Mary thought Jesus was the man responsible for taking care of the area, the gardener. Mary said to him, "If you have taken Jesus' body away, please tell me where he is. I will go and bring him back." Jesus said to her, "Mary." Mary turned to him and said in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Okay, so what does her story teach us? What do you all think? I think it speaks a lot to how much Mary cared about Jesus, that she was willing to go and find his body and bring it back if it had been taken away, put it in its rightful place and care for it like she planned to. And she was willing to challenge the first man that she saw that could have been responsible so that she could go and get that body back. Women back then did not speak to other men, to strange men that they didn't know. You could be punished for that. But Mary was brave. She wanted to serve Jesus.
What specifically captured my attention was that I don't think she really expected Jesus to come back from the dead. She didn't really expect Jesus to be alive. She still served him. She still honored him. Even though the man is dead, she never expected anything. She still served him. So that's the dedication I got from her.
Yes. How did Mary recognize Jesus in the story? What happened? that made Mary realize that this was Jesus she was speaking to. When he spoke to her, when she heard his voice. Mary and Jesus had a close relationship. So when she heard his voice, she realized. So we need to have a desire and to search for that kind of intimacy with Jesus, that if I hear his voice, I will recognize his call and I'll be ready to respond. Because he's my friend, I know him. More thoughts?
I think along a similar line as to what Andy was saying, Mary stepped out in faith even though she didn't have all the answers. It's clear that she didn't completely grasp what was going on, but she still tried to honor God, tried to do what was right.
Yes. Because sometimes God doesn't give us answers to all of our questions. Sometimes we will have doubts, and sometimes we'll be confused. But we've got to continue in our faith and to trust in him. More thoughts?
I'm just imagining it being me and my crazy mixture of emotions of like grief that my friend has said, and then anger that somebody stole his body, and then confusion when she sees him, and then like rejoicing, and just impressed with her clarity, like her clear mind through that, because she was a normal person, normal woman who deals with all these emotions all at once.
Yes. But it also shows the strength that women can have. That women can stand strong in faith and in clarity. And so men, we need to support that and to understand that. And I pray that my sons in the future will have wives that can stand strong in their faith. Only weak men want weak women. And so I hope for strong women for my sons in the future. They need it.